I've written a blog on commercial real estate every week for the past 5 years, and one thing I've learned is that some articles do much better than others. One in particular has had more views than 90% of my other articles combined. In this video, I'll reveal what topic was so popular, why it was so popular, and then I'll also illustrate the concept in more detail. Hi, I'm Chad. That particular article is about the differences between net rent, gross rent, and net effective rent. In fact, if you Google net rent versus gross rent, the article I wrote 3 years ago is at the top of the search results. The concept is one of the most important to understand in commercial real estate. It may sound fairly straightforward, but subtle differences in terminology can have dramatic effects. I guess it makes sense why the article was so popular. After all, every single person involved in commercial real estate, whether it's landlords, tenants, brokers, bankers, or lawyers, needs to have a solid understanding of the process on how rent is charged. So, somewhat along the lines of playing the hits, I wanted to add to that topic with this video. I'll preface this section with the caveat that this is a high-level overview of net rent and gross rent. Your market might do things a bit differently or have slight variations on the terminology. One thing that will be consistent, and it may sound obvious but stick with me here, is that landlords charge rent and tenants pay rent. How the rent is calculated is where things get more interesting. Let's look at a very simple example to begin with. A landlord owns a 10,000 square foot property and charges a tenant $10 per square foot gross to lease it. Before we get to the gross part, here's how that math would work. 10,000 square feet times $10 per square foot equals $100,000 rent per year. Unless it says otherwise, rates quoted in square footage is the cost per square foot per annum or per year. So if you want to determine the monthly rent, simply divide it by 12. Generally speaking, a gross rate will imply that rent includes property taxes, building insurance, common area maintenance, and basically any cost of keeping the building operational. For gross leases, you'll typically see one advertised rate. This method works well for short-term leases, which is why they're more common in residential. But if a commercial lease is 10 years long, as an example, a landlord would have a lot of uncertainty on what property taxes, insurance, and other costs are going to be in the future. That's why the vast majority of commercial leases break the rent into two components: net rent and operating costs. Sometimes it's called base rent and additional rent, and those terms are used interchangeably. The net rent is the set amount the tenant agrees to pay over the term of the rent. It may be a flat amount or may have yearly escalations, but that number is known by both the tenant and the landlord ahead of time. The additional rent or operating costs, on the other hand, account for all the costs of keeping the building operational. The costs are estimated at the beginning of the year, and if they come in lower than the budgeted amount, the tenant gets a refund. Conversely, if the costs come in higher, the tenant pays the difference. The intent of a net lease is to have the costs of operating the building flow through to the tenant so the landlord does not have increases in those costs erode the amount of rent being collected. For these types of leases, you'll typically see two advertised rates. Let's use an actual property listing to illustrate this further. A 19,890 square foot industrial property is marketed at $1,250 per square foot with operating costs at $375 per square foot. Here are the calculations. 19,890 square feet times $1,250 a square foot equals $248,625 of net rent per year. 19,890 square feet times $375 a square foot equals $74,587.50 in additional rent per year. For this particular property, the total rent would be $323,212.50, which again would be per year. I want to emphasize again, though, that this total amount will likely vary. Do you remember why? It will vary because the landlord is estimating what the operating costs will be, and it's almost impossible to hit that number dead on. Hopefully it's only a small adjustment once the bills have been reconciled, but pay attention to these numbers. This concept becomes second nature once you've done a few of these calculations, so I'd recommend doing a search for commercial real estate listings in your area and gather the data on a few properties. You'll want to look for size, net rent, and operating costs to do the calculations. If you want, find the property that's the largest that you can in your market and calculate what a tenant would be paying in monthly rent. It might really surprise you. In a future video, I'll also cover net effective rent. It's a slightly different concept, but it builds on what we just learned. I've also added a link to the original article I wrote in the description if you want to get a jump start on it. Also, if there's something specific you'd like me to cover about commercial real estate, please leave a comment in the description. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.